Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar, Prior Learning Assessment, an overview of relevant criteria and assumed practices, brought to you by the Multi-State Collaborative on Military Credit. I'm Jennifer Dahlquist, Vice President of the Midwestern Higher Education Compact. Before I begin, a few housekeeping items. The webcast will be approximately 60 minutes in length, with time at the end allotted for responding to questions. Please use the chat feature to post your questions. An archive of the webinar will be available online. At this point, I would like to extend a special word of thanks to the two foundations that have provided generous support to the Multi-State Collaborative on Military Credit, the Lumina Foundation and USA Funds. Without their support, our work would not be possible. The Multi-State Collaborative on Military Credit's mission is to facilitate an interstate partnership of 13 states and to translate competencies acquired by veterans through military training and experiences toward college credentials. States exchange information and share best practices in the areas of articulation of academic credit, licensure and certification, communication, and data technology and systems. To assist student veterans with completing post-secondary education and the transition into civilian employment, the MCMC has three goals. 1, to assist with critical life transitions from the military to post-secondary education and then from post-secondary education to civilian employment. 2, increase post-secondary education completion rates by creating models for the consistent, transparent, and effective awarding of credit for military training and experience that can be scaled. 3, establish a strong network of support, communication, documentation, and data collection among institutions and organizations for the purpose of promoting shared interests and tracking the efficacy of efforts to enhance service members' educational success. The MCMC has established 4 work groups to carry out its mission, which include articulation of academic credit, licensure and certification, communication and outreach, and data systems and technology. Today's webinar is made possible through the work of the MCMC Articulation of Academic Credit Work Group. Your moderators today are the work group co-chairs Dan Cullen and Diane Treese-Rusk. Dan serves as the Deputy Director for Academic Affairs at the Illinois Board of Higher Education, and Diane is the Director of Undergraduate Education for the University of Wisconsin System Administration. I will now turn it over to Dan.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to say just a couple words. I'm going to figure out if I can, there we go. As Jennifer noted, this is brought to you by the Articulation of Academic Credit Work Group, and our objectives with this group are to work toward the translation of military learning, whether that's through training or experience or some combination, into appropriate academic credit. And as we've had those discussions across the states, we've talked quite a few times about all the different competing interests that are involved in any institution's decisions around these points. And one of the most important is accreditation, and how will this look to accreditors? What will accreditors make of it? What will accreditors think of it? And so we've set up this webinar today to bring you just that information. So we're going to have Karen Solomon from the Higher Learning Commission will be speaking today about the Higher Learning Commission's assumed practices and criteria, specifically those that are applicable to the awarding of academic credit based on prior learning assessments. And she'll be considering best practices and common challenges. Also, through Diane's good work, we set up a couple of case scenarios to run through that Karen will discuss. And we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. On that note, if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box. We won't be answering those as they come in, but rather Diane will be working behind the scenes collecting those, and after Karen's finished with the prepared portion of the session, we'll work through those questions. So keep them coming as we talk, and expect answers towards the end. And so I'm going to turn it over to today's presenter, who is Karen Solomon, Dr. Karen Solomon from the Higher Learning Commission. She's the Vice President for Accreditation Relations and Director of the Standard Pathway. Turning it over now to you, Karen. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Welcome, everyone. We're going to talk this afternoon in a sort of a broad picture and then work our way down to specific requirements for the Higher Learning Commission. To try and give you a bit of an overview, there are several different regional accreditors across the country. I represent the big area in the blue there, Higher Learning Commission. You may be familiar with the term North Central Association. That term has been retired. There used to be 2 divisions of that. That's been dissolved, and so we are now just the Higher Learning Commission. Been in existence since the 1890s, and work in partnership with some of the other regions that we have across the country: New England, Middle States, Southern Association, Western Association. Western Association actually has 2 arms, one of the 4-year and research institution and another for the 2-year institution, and then the Northwest Association. We are regional accrediting agencies. We accredit entire institutions. There may be some specialized or programmatic accreditors that your institutions may be engaged with, and they may be for specific programs, such as an education program or a nursing program or an architecture program or things like that. We're going to talk today about institutional expectations for the Higher Learning Commission. I do want to alert you that if you're listening to this webinar and you're from another region, you will want to be checking on your region's expectations related to prior learning assessment. So we have some similarities but some differences. Last year in 2014, CALE posted a research brief, the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning, posted a research brief entitled Holding Tight or at Arm's Length. And in that document, there's actually a chart that actually outlines the similarities and variances between all of the regional accrediting agencies. It may be a document that you want to become more familiar with. Let's talk a little bit about the role of the regional accreditors. We evolved initially to really explore what were the differences between that type of level of education that was really growing into high school and what was different from colleges and universities. Back in the 1890s, the concept of high school was something that was emerging, and so there were groups that really looking at what were those differences, similarities, where were those sort of lines where you would exit one institution and begin in another. And that's where we really began the work of continuous quality. What is quality? How do we assure that our institutions are operating and offering quality programs? To do that, we operate from a set of foundational guiding values to what's strong for higher education. When the GI Bill came into effect and things like that, and the federal government decided these entities out there across the country that are checking on quality would probably be best to also be in partnership with identifying institutions that could be eligible to receive federal financial aid when it first evolved. And so over a period of time it evolved that we became, as regional accrediting agencies and also national accrediting agencies, as gatekeepers. And so institutions that once they become accredited can then apply to the federal government for access to federal financial aid. And because of that role that we have as a gatekeeper, we not only evaluate our institutions based off those guiding values, we also have to do some work on federal compliance to make sure that our institutions are meeting those expectations and those regulations set forth by the U.S. Department of Education. Our institutions regularly write and provide evidence that they meet the criteria for accreditation. That set of criteria is the same for all institutions, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the criteria as we go on today. What's interesting is when you think of higher education, we really have a triad. You know, the accreditors on one side, the U.S. Department of Education on another, and the states or sovereign nations as the other part of the triangle. Each of those parts have their own expectations, even as it relates to prior learning assessment. And I think that's one of the important pieces for you to think about today is how are you in alignment with what your state requirements are, what your accreditors' requirements are, and maybe what the requirements for the U.S. Department of Education may be. And we do not necessarily have those well aligned. And so as you're thinking about making sure that you have the appropriate approvals or doing the right things, It's not just to focus on the accreditor. You really need to look at all three parts of the triad because there may be very differing expectations from some of those different groups. In terms of assuring quality, we expect that that responsibility sits with the institution. So we are, as an accrediting agency, expect that the institution takes the initiative to ensure quality. At points in time, then we go in and check to make sure that that's actually taking place. So the quality should be year-round, year after year, not just at the time of a review, but we sort of step in at different points during an accreditation cycle and make sure that the institution's evidence that it's putting forth that says it provides quality is actually credible and in place. So we do a bit of triangulation when we review the institution based on some of its narrative or argument, based on evidence documents provided by the institution, and then also through a peer review process where peer reviewers may be engaging with different members of the institution. Let's now start to move into the Commission's criteria for accreditation. If you want to review the criteria for accreditation, it's available on our website, which is hlcommission.org. And on that big black bar that you'll see on our website, you'll see one that says accreditation. If you hover on that, you'll see one that says criteria for accreditation. And then you can actually scroll right to the criteria for accreditation and follow that. You see another circle on the right-hand side of the screen that shows criteria, assumed practices, and obligations of affiliation. We are going to be talking about the criteria for accreditation and some of the applicable assumed practices today. Both of the full detail of those are available on our website. Let's talk a bit about the elements of accreditation. Our guiding values are what we set forth as fundamental ways that organizations operate as higher ed institutions. Those are our intentions. Then we build onto that our criteria for accreditation. And that's how our institutions demonstrate the quality of what they provide as an institution. Obligations of affiliation, relatively new for our commission, and they're basically the rules of being a good member, about paying bills, dues and fees on time, having a person available for the public to talk to on the phone instead of just having to fill out electronic web-based lead forms and things like that. So the guiding values are that fundamental piece. Obligations of affiliation are for institutions that are accredited, this is the rules of your membership. It's important to note that accreditation is actually voluntary. Well, it's voluntary in some ways. If an institution wants access to federal financial aid, they need to be accredited. But they have to choose to want to go through the accreditation process. There may be different types of accreditations institutions are actually looking for. Each of those accreditors develops their own criteria for accreditation. There are many similarities, but they're all fine-tuned to their membership. Because it's a membership organization, our members are the ones that really finally sign off on the criteria for accreditation. They may be engaged in the rework or rewrite of the criteria, and then typically the board of trustees or board of directors for each of the accrediting agencies are made up of representatives from those different organizations or institutions. Our assumed practices are just what we call them. We assume that these are basic practices that institutions will follow at any point in time. They're basically the rules of what it means to be a higher ed institution. Our eligibility requirements are a little bit more detailed, but those are for institutions that are just coming through our application process and trying to become accredited. And then we also have, as I mentioned before, that gatekeeper responsibility. So there are many policies that we have in place and processes that we have to follow that we actually review that institutions are meeting those federal requirements. So let's talk a bit about the criterion because this is really the heart of the session this afternoon. The criteria for accreditation, you have the criteria. We have 5 criteria in this region. They're broad statements, and we're going to walk through each one of the criteria. And institutions must address those explicitly when they're coming up for an assigned review. Underneath each of those criteria are core components that further flesh out and define the criterion, focus a little bit more finely on some specific elements that the institution must write to and provide evidence for. And then subcomponents may or may not be applicable depending on the type of institution that you're at. But they are actually, once again, make it a little bit more granular about what we're looking for. We revised our criteria and put new criteria into place in 2013. And as we were going through a multi-year process of revisions of the criteria, one of the things that we wanted to do was make it more explicit in the levels of the core components and the subcomponents, because our institutions were saying, we're not quite sure what the Commission's asking for. Our previous criteria were very soft, a lot of interpretation that was left out there. So there was interpretation by the institution, and then there was also interpretation by the peer reviewers. Peer reviewers, I've mentioned those folks a few times. Our peer reviewers are actually volunteers. They come in most cases from our member institutions. They may come from other institutions across the country. They may actually come from public. In one of our accreditation processes, we use members from business and industry to actually serve in some of the peer review roles. Right now, we have almost 1,800 peer reviewers. We train our peer reviewers. They go through either face-to-face or online training. They are on many different types of reviews throughout the year. They may be working on evaluating the criteria for accreditation. They may be doing that electronically, or they may be actually visiting the campuses. They may be reviewing requests for approval of new programs or distance education or new campuses or things like that. They also may then be evaluating institutions that have multiple locations across several states, or they actually serve on part of our decision-making committees. And so they take on a variety of different roles within the organization, and they are really the folks that actually do the evaluation of quality. Now, I serve as a staff liaison to a group of institutions that I work with, and then I also coordinate the reviews with peer reviewers. And so I'm sort of that middle person in between, making sure that the processes are moving smoothly, helping institutions as they may be going through some critical times. But typically, most of our reviews are completed by peer reviewers. And the peer reviewer that completes the review, or the team that completes the review, actually only makes the recommendation. It will be another group of peer reviewers that actually approve that recommendation. So there's typically at least 2 levels of peer review with every single transaction. Sometimes there may be 3 levels if some of those cases actually go to our Board of Trustees. And so peer review is the heart and the core of the way that accreditors do their work. It's important to keep in mind, and that's why we set such specifics into our core components and subcomponents, so our institutions knew what to write to and what information to provide, and it also became a stronger guidepost for our peer reviewers as they were doing their work. Let's talk about the criteria. There are 5 criteria. The first criteria is about mission. And remember, these criteria for all of our institutions. We have 998 member institutions. We cover 19 states. We accredit 2-year community colleges or technical schools, art schools, tribal colleges, faith-based institutions, regional public universities, land grant and major high-level research institutions, and the whole range in between, public and private, for-profit and not-for-profit institutions. They all work from the same criteria, but their starting point is actually with the mission. How does the institution that's coming up for review or evaluation of the criteria demonstrate that it's working from the premises of its mission? So this is where we expect the institution's mission is articulated publicly and it's clear, and it really can be pointed to how it guides the operations for the institution in terms of academic programs, in terms of strategic initiatives and things like that. So criteria number 1 is mission. Number 2 is really pushing for the institution to identify how it operates with ethical and responsible conduct. And you may say, how do we prove that we do that? Well, there may be some ways where you may have conflict of interest expectations for employees and for trustees. You also provide information in a variety of different ways. This is when we start to talk about, drill down a bit and talk about core components. So one of the core components in this criterion actually states that the institution presents itself clearly and completely to students and the public with regards to programs, requirements, faculty and staff, cost to students, control, and accreditation relationships. This may be in one point where you as an institution clearly point out how you provide information about prior learning assessment, where that's presented within maybe the student catalog or on your website or things like that, being able to provide that as a piece of evidence to support your claims that you do present yourself clearly and publicly, clearly and completely would be a great point of evidence. Criterion 3 then is about teaching and learning. Actually, Criterion 3 and 4 are about teaching and learning, but Criterion 3 is about the front end. How do you set up your academic programs to be rigorous? How do you have the appropriate personnel and support services to ensure that that will happen? And then also, how do you build in systems and processes to evaluate that rigor? And so Criterion 3 is really on the front end. But you know here that it says the institution provides high quality education wherever and however its offerings are delivered. So some of you may be working at an institution that has a main campus, has additional locations or branch campuses, or offers programs virtually. You should be able to articulate across those programs how you know that you can ensure that there's rigor and quality in those programs. In this case, it may also be that if you have students with high percentages of prior learning being incorporated into their transcript and recognized and credits awarded for that, that you can still demonstrate, but by the time the student completes that program of study, they have the same solid foundation of understanding that you would have if you had a student that had been native to the institution all along. Criterion 4 then asks the institution to prove how it knows that its programs are not only rigorous, that the quality's there, but there's a continuous cycle of improvement. And so this is where we start to push a little bit more strongly on the institution in terms of program review, in terms of assessment of student learning, and in terms of expectations for persistence and completion, to set goals and define those points of student success, and then being able to demonstrate once that ongoing cycle of improvement is taking place in all of those areas. Criterion core component 4A actually once again draws out a little bit more finely our expectations that may relate to prior learning assessment. So let's take a look at this. Core component 4A calls for the institution to demonstrate responsibility for the quality of its educational programs. Remember when I spoke about those subcomponents? Here are some of those subcomponents that you may want to be aware of. 4A2, the institution evaluates all the credit that it transcripts, including what it awards for experiential learning or other forms of prior learning, or relies on the evaluation of responsible third parties. So this may be that a team may be looking to see how the institution has set up processes and systems to evaluate credit when it's considering it for prior learning. It may also be what systems and processes have been put into place to bring on the ACE credit recommendations. It could be through portfolio reviews, but expectations that the institution actually has some evaluation procedure in there. And then the other subcomponent related to this is that the institution has policies that assure that the quality of the credit, has policies that assure the quality of the credit it accepts and transfer. So that may vary from institution to institution. But what I often see is our institutions are weak in this. They may accept a lot of credit, but they're just letting it flow right in. They haven't set thresholds of what type of credit they will accept or not, what courses will be accepted or not. And they may not have clear policies that a peer reviewer could actually see. Some of the people within the institution could articulate how that work is actually completed. For some of our institutions, this is where it's gotten to be a bit soft in the work that they do as they're trying to bring credits to the students' transcripts. Criterion number 5, our last criterion, is pushing on resources planning and institutional effectiveness. Basically, how does the institution have those structures and processes in place to continue to meet the criteria for accreditation going forward? But it also then calls for the institution to demonstrate that it has systemic and ongoing planning that's taking place across the institution that wraps back around and leads with the mission. And so this is where institutions are doing quite a bit of work of saying this is how we're going to continue moving forward. This is how we know we have the resources that we need now and for the future. And here's where our vision is, and here's where our actual plans with outcomes, goals assigned, and things like that that will take us into that future. For some of our institutions, they're in the midst of a lot of flux right now. So planning and having those guiding documents to be able to move through some pretty rough years has been really important to many of our institutions. Those that have not really taken that to heart are finding themselves really in a difficult situation in many cases at this point in time. So that's it with the criteria for accreditation. Let's shift now to the assumed practices. There are 4 large assumed practices. One about integrity again. These are assumed. We assume that at any point in time our institutions will be following these assumed practices. We also then, once again, make some more definitions in terms of teaching and learning, both that front end and that back end of teaching and learning, and then also assumed practices related to resources and planning. What assumed practices would actually align with some of the work with prior learning assessment? In A5, it actually goes back again to that piece that I mentioned before about public information. We have an assumed practice that calls for the institution to have policies on the acceptance of transfer credit, including how it is applied to degree requirements. What's interesting here, you'll see that the institution makes no promises to prospective students regarding the acceptance of credit awarded by examination, credit for prior learning, or credit for transfer until an evaluation has been conducted. So this is not where the admissions staff would say, oh, we'll take anything that you send to us. There should be that evaluation process, which I just mentioned, and this is once again where we highlight on this issue. Now this assumed practices on the acceptance of transfer credits. We have not yet, but we are in discussion about potentially building another assumed practice that would be an expectation that an institution would have policies on the acceptance of prior learning credit. Pulling this out a little bit more clearly. Many of our institutions, we're finding this has been a pretty soft area. The public can seldom get information about what the process is, how it will be conducted, and things like that. And so we are in discussions with the Board of Trustees wanting some more clarification about our expectations related across all forms of prior learning acceptance, prior learning. Over in B1, we have another assumed practice, and this really goes to the concept of residency. We expect that an institution, at a minimum, will provide at least 25% of the program. Some of you may be sitting there listening going, oh my gosh, our institution would not allow a student to graduate if we only taught them 25% of the classes. But we do have some institutions that have a wide range of accepting credit from a variety of different sources, whether it's other institutions, prior learning, experiential learning, a whole range. When we built the assumed practices in correlation with the criteria in 2013, we put this in as a threshold. We didn't have one before, and we actually did have some institutions where they were making some claims that they had not taught any courses and just accumulated a wide range of credits and then awarded a degree. That was a concern to our membership, and they felt that we needed a threshold of engagement by an institution with a student before awarding a degree. This expectation, though, careful to note, does not require this to be the last 25% of the program. This could be throughout the program or at the beginning of the program, could engage with reverse transfer and things like that. So there is some flexibility by the institution in this expectation. Now, this is our assumed practice, but we recognize that many institutions have a much higher threshold for what they'll accept or allow for prior learning. Another assumed practice here, once again, going back into process, the institution has a process for assuring that all courses transferred and applied demonstrate equivalence with its own courses required for that degree or are of equivalent rigor. What's been interesting, we've seen a trend over time where institutions have actually applied credits towards a degree with courses that they really don't have any awareness or understanding of how to evaluate some of that learning. And they may not even apply to any of their programs. And so this is once again where we're pushing back into that rigor expectation. So this is where an assumed practice, we would also call out an institution to make sure that they are making that application of credit appropriately. Another assumed practice, that the institution has a clear policy on the maximum allowable credit for prior learning as a reasonable portion of the credits required to complete the student's program. A credit awarded is documented, evaluated, once again evaluated, and appropriate for the level of degree awarded. Okay, this does not apply for credit from other institutions, but we're expecting that our institutions have clear policy on the maximum allowable credit. So what has changed over time? We used to really look at more of the front end of processes at the commission, looking at how things were sort of built up. Now we're focused more on the outcomes. And so we're expecting to see evidence of effectiveness of processes. So we would be looking to see what is your evaluation process for considering prior learning credit. Who is involved in that? How do you, again, take a look at your own process? And when do you come through and evaluate the process for considering prior learning? And that really goes into Criterion 5 and looking at the institution's operations and how you make sure that the way that you move through the process of awarding credit is appropriate to the institution, maybe changing expectations in society or things like that. So as you'll see here, a lot of what we talked about, evaluation, process, systems, structure, and we're going to look for evidence of that, maybe through analysis reports, information regarding committees that are working to align and continue to realign courses with the institution's credits with courses at the institution. Could be through program review and how some of that may shift the expectations for what can be accepted in prior learning, how students that have come in with prior learning credit, how they've been tracked in terms of student success in other courses through assessment of student learning or persistence and completion. So there are a lot of ways to link with students and prior learning and institutional courses to achieve those students that actually graduate and receive a degree. Diane was really helpful in putting together a couple case examples, and we wanted to take a look at this as a group today. So for the first case example, we've got a couple things in this case here. This is an institution that is awarding a bachelor's degree. As you can see on the bottom, a maximum of 60 credits may be applied to the bachelor's degree. So in this case, as the base number of credits required for a bachelor's degree is 120 credits, this institution is only allowing 50% of the credits to be provided through some of these options listed here. Okay. So first we have 30 credits that are being awarded based on ACE credit recommendations. And in the third column here, you'll see that the evaluator was either a content expert or a faculty member, as far as that goes. And this is done on a case-by-case basis. but may also be combined with another element. And then it's transcribed as a course or elective credit as pass-fail. But interestingly enough here, these credits don't apply towards that residency expectation, and that's something to always keep in mind. Where do courses brought in through prior learning, are they considered towards residency or not? In our scenarios today, most are not, but there may be a few in the next case example that are. An additional 24 credits are given through program review, and this is by external content expert, and that may be in a contractual relationship. Many of our institutions also have the portfolio review completed by their own faculty. There is an expectation that they would have some type of standardized process. Once again, going to that process and structure so that you can really demonstrate that each student and their work has been evaluated fairly as each case comes through. And this is transcribed as a course or elective credit. And then last could be a variety of different tests. Could be a CLEP test, AP tests, things like that. This is from an external vendor. The method is the standardized testing. But what's interesting here is your institution would need to set thresholds of what you would accept as appropriate scores or what you would not accept, what would be accepted towards the overall degree or the student's academic program specific. So there are a lot of questions when we get into some of the standardized tests and what our institutions will accept as far as that goes. Okay, let's move on here to case number 2. Case number 2 here allows for 40 credits to be applied to the bachelor's degree or 20 credits to be applied to the associate's degree. So about a third of the degree would be eligible for PLA. And we've got almost the same formats here, except we've added a new one, and that is a departmental exam. And this may be something that's developed internally by content experts or faculty members, and it's a comprehensive, and it may be a comprehensive exam. If a student wants to gain credit for getting through one course, could that summative exam that's given at the end of the term be an appropriate tool to see if the student has the learning an understanding of some of the key elements of that course before providing a grade for that course. So in this example, we've got several different methods across all of the different formats here. But in this case, you'll see over in the far right-hand column that the course is either pass-fail or it could be graded. But the pass-fail courses do not count towards that residency requirement. Once again, what are your systems and policies, or excuse me, your policies and processes for making determinations of what will you accept as credit, what will be the type of evaluation or the method that you're going to utilize for that, and then how is it transcripted? As we've just briefly walked through these case examples, I see a lot of policy implications here, I see a lot of process implications here, but more importantly, I see a lot of communication opportunities for you to be able to share with students what are the methods of consideration and how will those be transcripted. And I could probably this afternoon hop onto 10 of your institution's websites and look for information about prior learning assessment or actually download a student catalog, and would be very challenged to find detailed information about how students may achieve credits for some of their prior learning, and then how it would be awarded and what that process would be. For some of our institutions, I think they are still at the stage where they may have a handout or a piece of paper that they give a student or things like that, but not necessarily well defined or well articulated. It's something I think many of our institutions need to work on. But there's a lot of opportunity there. We've got a lot of people that are bringing life experience into our institutions, and they want the opportunity to gain credit for that. So it's up to our institutions to make sure that they can evaluate it, have defined systems and processes, be able to articulate that and have evidence that they're working through it, and then lastly, being able to communicate what those expectations are and what the possibilities are for potential students. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to some questions.
Thanks, Karen. While we're queuing the questions up, I'll just make a couple comments. First, for everyone on the webinar, please note that as a reminder, please feel free to use that chat function. If you type in your questions in the chat function, Diane right now is sorting through those, and we'll be posing those to Karen in just a minute. And while that's going on, and while you're submitting questions and Diane's organizing, I'm just going to make a couple quick kind of conclusory comments, but as we transition into questions. And first, I want to make sure that, again, we thank everyone who needs to be thanked, the funders, Lumina Foundation and USA Funds, which Jennifer already said, but in addition to that, we want to make sure we thank Jennifer and everyone at MEC, the Midwestern Higher Education Compact, and also Karen and HLC for participating in this. And I need to acknowledge that Diane has done most of the work on organizing and putting all this together and making sure that this happened. For those of you who have not been involved with MEC and the MCMC project, I would invite you to go to the web page. If you just go to mhec.org/MCMC, the Midwestern Higher Education Compact.org, MCMC for Multi-State Collaborative on Military Credit, you'll find quite a few resources there. This webinar will be posted once it's been recorded and processed, and you'll see there's a previous webinar that was on data that's already posted, and that might be of interest as well. And then more information will be emerging, and also information about our work groups. And if you have any questions about any of those, getting involved with any of those work groups, let us know. You can contact MEC, and they'll make sure that we get that information. I'm not sure, Diane, are you ready to switch to questions?
I sure am ready.
Okay, thanks.
So thanks a lot, Dan. So we have a few questions in the queue. However, it's not too late. So if something comes up that you think of, please type it in, and we'll get through the questions we have right now. So our first question comes from Ohio, and in Ohio there is a transfer module at the general education level that guarantees transfer and applicability of credit among all public institutions of higher education. And in some cases, this means, as relative to prior learning assessment, it might mean that institutions may do an assessment of a challenge through some format, but not all institutions will have a course so that they can assign equivalent course credit. And some institutions have related that they wonder what HLC's policy is, because presumably elective credit, perhaps, let's say in the social science area, could be assigned to the course. So it could be transcribed as a social science elective that yields 3 credits, and a student may be able to apply that to the standardized general education curriculum. And so the question is, what would HLC think in terms of this, and what policy and assumed practices about non-equivalent incoming courses, how might that apply to a situation like this?
That's a great question, and that goes back to one of my first slides about the Triad. This is where I think it's challenging for some of our institutions to work across state expectations, accreditor expectations, and U.S. Department of Education expectations. Our expectation would be, and our assumed practice would be, that we expect that institutions would still have an ability to ensure that coherence of the program. So just to bring in a course that maybe another institution, it would have been appropriate to be at that institution, to bring it into your institution may be questionable. How have you evaluated that transfer of prior learning that it was awarded as prior learning from another institution? I think that bears a lot more conversation both within your state and the expectations that are there, and probably more on a case-to-case basis at the commission. Because it could vary dramatically. We've seen some interesting courses that have been accepted by some institutions where they really don't have any experience in, and it really doesn't fit into any of their academic programs, trying to be applied as an elective when it just doesn't help build that coherent program. And that's why I keep going back to that word coherence and quality within the programs.
Okay, thanks. So another question is related to what we might consider internal or external assessment of credit for prior learning. As part of the discussion, it was stated that credit for prior learning can be evaluated by a responsible third party. However, different institutions might have different policies pertaining to the internal or external assessment of that. So external might mean a responsible third party did the assessment of the prior learning, and an internal might be that the institution did it, such as in a portfolio or a departmental exam that's done by a faculty member within the institution. Number one, does HLC perceive to be any differences in terms of the practices between when it's externally conducted by a responsible third party or internally by the institution? And two, are there any cases in which an institution should establish and therefore notify HLC or seek approval of a contractual or consortial arrangement when an institution uses an external agency to assess the learning?
We have, you've packed about 5 questions into that. So let me try to unbundle that. First of all, contractual or consortial relationships. For everyone that's here on the webinar today, a contractual relationship in our language, in our policy, actually is the exact same as what is required by the U.S. Department of Education. So a contractual relationship is another entity that is not an institution that's recognized by an accrediting agency. That's an accrediting agency that's been recognized by the U.S. Department of Education. So that may be a third-party vendor. It could be a university over in Switzerland. Consortial relationships are with other institutions that are accredited by a U.S. Department of Education recognized accreditor. So if the community college down the road from you is accredited by the Higher Learning Commission, and you're working together with them, first of all, it's most likely a straight transfer of credit from one institution to another. Second of all, though, it may be that you're sharing some programs together. Contractual relationships really go to the point when another entity or consortial relationship, when that other entity is providing some of your academic offering to your students. And so that may be that you've hired a third-party vendor to teach a paramedic program or things like that, and they do part of that for the institution. You provide the general education courses, and then the student graduates with that emergency medicine degree. That contractual relationship would need our approval. To work with another vendor that evaluates learning, whether it is an organization like ACE or TAIL, or it is one of the groups out there that actually evaluates international credit and then transcripts that for institutions on a case-by-case basis, those are not contractual relationships that we actually require approval for. That's different. That goes back to our policies and practices about the transfer of credit, or the awarding of credit that way. It's not, but that goes on your transcript very transparently. It shows that these were not credits that were taught by the institution or delivered by the institution. In contractual relationships and often consortial relationships, you see a student's transcript and it says the course there, Math 251, and that could have been taught by somebody else at another institution or by a third-party vendor, but it appears on the transcript as though your institution actually taught that. So that's where there's a line there, but we do not require contractual approval. Now your other piece was, what about responsible third parties? We still expect that our institutions will have some process to vet those different providers and still have oversight on what's coming into the institution. Not just everything that has been recommended through one of those providers is just automatically moved into a student's transcripts. There may be some lists are developed and articulated over the years of what course credit recommendations you will accept and what won't. based on your academic program offerings at your institution. So it's up to the institution to make that determination. But we recognize that military credit and the ACE recommendations are well validated, and we support that thoroughly.
Okay, thanks. This is somewhat related. The question is, are there any unique features institutions need to consider related to PLA based on military training and experience?
We have not defined that. We we work with so many different types of institutions that there may be different types of experience that our institutions, we still give our institutions the latitude to make that determination. But what I think is very helpful is that much of the military work and the learning is documented through those branches and their training programs and things like that, and that's brought in. Now, if you are thinking about on-the-ground experience that somebody's had out in the field, then that may actually articulate more into portfolio review, where some of our institutions may ask students to write about their experience or be able to provide evidence of it in different ways, and that may shift into some different types of PLA. So there's a couple different things we talk about when we're talking about military experience, and I'm not sure everyone always is on the same page, whether it's the real military courses and training or whether it's field experience. And how those are articulated institutions may need a little bit of work.
Thanks. So this question has to do with the number of credits that are allowable. And the participant wonders, is there an issue with limiting the incoming credit that is awarded, and let's parcel out based on a prior learning assessment credit awarded and then also transfer credit, two different things. Is there a limit in based on where it applies to the degree as well as limiting it based on the format it was taken under?
Well, that's really interesting. We leave that to our institutions. We have some institutions that will only accept AP credit. Some will not accept AP credit. Some will accept military credit. Some may not. It depends on our institutions. The population of students that they serve may also have a big factor on whether they will even consider the type of credit or limit it. I've seen some institutions where they'll allow 6 or 9 hours of prior learning assessment, and that may be it. They may also limit to 20 or 25 credits for a bachelor's degree of transfer credit, because the faculty there at that institution really hold dear that their curriculum and the way they've organized it is going to provide the rigor for the program that they want to deliver to students. And having more external learning environments and credits awarded for that actually sort of makes it more difficult to ensure that there's rigor in that program. So they want the students to really channel through the courses that they've built so they have that coherence in the learning and can demonstrate that. Most of our institutions, from what I've seen in the more recent years, expect that prior learning is something that is identified and defined at the time the student's preparing to enroll at the institution, not something that suddenly pops up in the midst of a student's enrollment at an institution 2 years down the road. That's for prior learning. But what we have seen quite a bit of, institutions being surprised that they've got a full-time student enrolled, taking a heavy load at the institution, finishes up that term only to receive a transcript from another institution where the student has been enrolled as an online student or taking courses maybe someplace else and wants those transferred in. That causes some real concerns about just workload and things like that for the students. And what the institution thought the path that they were on versus what they were doing out there. And so I do know that some of our institutions have started to limit transfer of credit acceptance for students that are enrolled full-time that also are earning credit someplace else during that time, which is real concern about the quality and who's actually doing the work and things like that.
Great. So before I go on to the next question, I want to tell individuals we probably have more questions than we'll have time to discuss today. We will maintain a list of questions and make sure that those are posted with answers out there. So if you don't hear your question being asked, we will not forget about you. So this next question has to do a bit with thinking about the assessment and evaluation. And one question addressed in this way are for states that coordinate policy around credit for prior learning, and what are the requirements to make sure that the policy is working for their institutions? And I think that aligns somewhat with another question that has to do with what are some suggested best practices relating to continuous improvement and program of review of PLA programs? And that could pertain to policy that comes from state agencies and an institution must implement, as well as an institution's own policies and practices around PLA.
Well, I think MHEC as a group, I think is a great starting point or a launching point to build some common understanding and have guidelines and things like that that can be referenced across institutions, and not only by one individual or two individuals at the institution, but across several different committees that may touch on this, faculty groups, registrar's offices, enrollment management offices, wherever the conversations may go. I think that's exactly what we need. Some of our states are very clear on prior learning assessment and expectations, and others take a real hands-off approach to their institutions, not just for this, but whether they need approval for new programs or anything else. So it really varies from state to state. With us having 19 states in our region, we see all different forms of oversight and engagement from that standpoint. Did I miss part of that question?
I think that you addressed that the institution must consider that sort of triangle, and I think perhaps the question was around evaluation practices and what should be expected in terms of continuous improvement. If HLC has any specific insights as to what institutions should do.
I think this goes back to assessment of student learning and program review, which are both in Criterion 4. Our expectation is that the institution is constantly out there scanning, evaluating. Maybe that if you're bringing in a population of students that you're awarding more prior learning to, how are they doing in their upper level courses? As you draw them out, how are they doing academically in terms of persistence and things like that? Are you maybe awarding some credit that actually is not setting the student up to be successful as they get into the program of study? So maybe that's during that program review phase where you say, we've got a whole population of military students here, but they're not succeeding when they get to a couple of these courses. What did we maybe give them credit for that they skipped some learning or understanding that we either make our change to what we award, we provide a different course, we provide some advanced modules so that students can prep for that course, different types of things. So you're constantly out there working on that continuous improvement model.
Great, and like I said, questions we didn't get to, we will post some answers for you, so you can. We'll inform you of where you can find the rest of the responses. And at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Jennifer.
Thanks, Diane, and thank you to all of our presenters today. We hope that you found the information presented helpful. If you would like to learn more about MEC and the MCMC, we invite you to join the conversation by contributing your successes to our MCMC Facebook page or lending your expertise to our LinkedIn group. Please feel free to reach out to me at any time with questions regarding MEC or the MCMC. As stated at the beginning, this webinar will be archived online shortly, and as Diane stated, we'll be posting responses to the questions shortly. We welcome your feedback, so please take a moment to complete the survey at the conclusion of the webinar. Thank you for your time today.